This is not the box that made Tame Impala's career. Actually, it's way better than that box. But you're not actually here to find out about this box just yet. First, let me tell you why you're actually here, whether you know it or not, which is to find out what's the difference between these two drum samples. Between these two bass lines. These synthesizers. Vocals. But I hear it inside my head all day. But I hear it inside my head all day. Even just these two random noises? You might be thinking, there must be a bunch of effects going on, or a bunch of layers or plugins to make the difference between each of those two samples. But if so, you'd be surprised to hear that actually the difference is just toggling one switch on this magic box. Ooh, magic box. Ooh, shiny. To put it a different way, the difference between each of those two clips is actually the magic behind Tame Impala. Specifically, his early two albums, including this one, his second album, Lonerism, which, depending on my mood that day, is often my answer to what's the best album of all time. But to answer the question of what makes this box so special, first, I've got to tell you a story. A story about two men. The first man's name is Mr. T. Impala. Just kidding, this is Kevin Parker, and he's the one guy from the meme that Tame Impala is just one guy. He wanted to make psychedelic rock, so he wrote a fantastic record called Inner Speaker and brought it to a famous recording engineer, Dave Fridman, who's the second man in the story. I used to think that my favorite musical genre was psychedelic rock. Then I looked at the records that this guy produced and realized that actually my favorite musical genre is Dave Fridman. He produced or engineered most of my favorite bands, including The Flaming Lips, MGMT, Magdalena Bay, and of course, Tame Impala. Neither of them have talked much about their collaboration, but as far as I can tell, the story of them goes something like this. When Kevin brought Inner Speaker to him, Dave had a trick up his sleeve that he used on many different tracks on many different albums before, and proceeded to use it on every track on this album. It's called the Shure LevelLoc. It's instantly iconic, making Kevin's instrumentation as lush, dreamy, and psychedelic as you can hope to achieve, and his drums as loud as you can manage. Next thing you know, you look at photos of Kevin recording Lonerism, and he's got a Shure SE30, which is basically just a LevelLoc with some mic preamps taped to the side. He goes back to Dave to get Lonerism engineered, and wouldn't you know it, there's definitely LevelLoc sounds all over it all over again. And then they all lived happily ever after. Oh, are we back already? Oh, that was quick. What a great story, Mark. With that lead-in, you might be thinking, the LevelLoc must have been some highly precise, extremely expensive piece of audio engineering, right? Well, actually no, in fact it couldn't be further from the case. Shure actually released the LevelLoc in the late 60s for malls, offices, other places with big PA systems, and the purpose was just so that no matter who was talking, no matter what microphone they're using, how quietly they were talking, etc., any of those variables, it would always keep the level locked, wink, at the absolute peak so that it would always be coming out at a consistent level out of the speakers. Eventually, and by that I mean like decades later, Dave Fridman and other audio engineers and producers would dig these things out of like old dusty storerooms. They would find them at thrift stores. They would literally dig them out of garbage cans. I'm pretty sure I read somewhere on the internet. And they did this because they actually recognized this thing had a lot of musical production value despite what it was intended to be used for in the first place. Once you learn to look past the like rough facade that this thing's sound has, you realize it has so much power, so much potential. Everything that goes through it just cuts straight through the mix and punches you straight in the face. And it works as a compressor, a limiter, to some extent a distortion pedal, and okay, hold on. I know I just threw a lot of terms at you, and depending on how much familiarity you have with audio engineering, you might not have heard of some of them, but no matter what level of familiarity you have, give me just 30 seconds and I'll perfectly explain all of it, I promise. Ready, and go. This is an audio waveform. This part is quiet, this part is loud. The bigger the difference between quiet and loud, the more dynamic range you have. Compressors have a threshold, and everything above the threshold it makes quiet, and then takes the whole signal and makes it louder, which is called makeup gain because it makes up for the quieterness. Look, the dynamic range is compressed. The amount of quieterness is called the ratio, and if you crank the ratio to max, suddenly it has a brick ceiling, so this is now called a limiter because it limits the ceiling to this level. Distortion is making the signal louder, fuzzier, and less clean on purpose because it sounds cool. See, that wasn't so bad, right? But you might be saying, the more important question than what is a compressor is what does a compressor do? What does a compressor do? Or I guess, what does a compressor sound like? And like, I really want to show you. I really do. And I promise I will show you by the end of the video, but... Yeah. My bosses are telling me that you don't deserve it yet. So that's awkward. You see, this video turned out to be a bit of an exception because I've been diving down this like DIY audio rabbit hole, but usually this channel is about explaining like electrical engineering and like software topics and that kind of thing, and you haven't had to sit through any like boring electrical engineering jargon yet. So we're gonna have to get through a little bit of that, but I promise that I'm gonna break it down simply enough that literally anybody can understand it. And even if you're just interested in audio, I think understanding just a few of these concepts that I'm gonna explain is gonna be super helpful in like really understanding how a compressor works. The history of the DIY audio community remaking the LevelLoc is kind of a long and winding road, so I'll just give you a quick summary and say that there was this guy named Drew that made a version called the FredLoc. A lot of people have kind of iterated on the FredLoc over the years, with the most recent attempt being by this guy named Bow and Error on the Free Stomp Boxes forum, who made a version called the LevelLocker, and it's so much better than the original version, like so much better. You see, the original LevelLoc had like basically no customization. It had an input knob, which changed the volume of the signal that you're sending into it, and it had a distance switch, which no, that is not a standard feature on compressors, but actually what they meant by distance is actually what we just learned is the threshold. So the threshold of the compressor going in. Remember that this thing isn't for audio engineers, this thing is for like regular people talking to an office mic PA system. So they had to make it so that anybody sitting down at the desk could operate one of these things. But we do want to use it for audio engineering, and we just learned all about all of the intricate things that compressors can do, so we would love to have extra features to be able to control each of those parameters. And thankfully, with this upgraded circuit, we can have them. Don't worry, I'm not going to go over all the particulars of the circuit in detail, but what I am going to do is I'm going to go over it at like a high functional level. I'm going to replace the parts of the circuit with what they do. We can pretty quickly pass over this entire section because it is just the power input. If we move up here, you can see the actual input of the circuit. This is where your mic or your instrument will actually plug in. It then goes through our first added feature, which is the pad switch. And so what this does is it lets you select between doing nothing or making the audio way quieter or way quieter. And then coupled with this, which is the input volume knob, you can see the full input volume control package. And as you'll see, that is actually really important to the sound, not just the volume level. We then very quickly move on to this guy, which already is the heart of the compressor. Yes, this guy is the most important piece and does pretty much all of the compression in the entire circuit. This is called a FET. And if you ever heard of the term FET compressor, that's why it's called that. Basically, what it does is it takes the electricity coming in from your input signal and adds in some juice through this mystery arrow. We'll come back to that in a second. The amount of juice that it adds depends on how much electricity is coming in through the mystery arrow. And so the more that comes in, the more it gets compressed. The juiced up audio travels up here, and I'm going to call this section gain stage 1 because all it does is it adds gain or makes the volume louder by a set amount every time, no matter what is coming in. And then we come down here to our next feature, which is the threshold switch. So this is what on the original LevelLoc was the distance selector. And the way that the different thresholds work is that they take a different amount of juice back out of the signal by dumping them to ground through various resistors. We then travel up here to gain stage 2, which, like gain stage 1, just increases the volume by a set amount. Here we've got a pretty interesting part of the circuit because it works into two paths, and actually the southern path, if you're anything like me, you'll be surprised to hear, is the output. Yes, that's right, we're already at the output of the circuit. Right here we have the output volume knob, and if we go over here, this is the output plug that you would plug into your audio interface or whatever else you're using to record or play the audio. But if that's the output, how is there a whole other part of the circuit? Well, if we follow the northern path, then now we'll see gain stage 3, which, yes, repeat after me, it just makes the output louder by a set amount. And then we travel to our final new feature, which is the release speed switch, which has normal, medium, and slow. And the way that that switch works is by dumping a certain amount of the juice to ground, but this time instead of through a resistor, through these, which are capacitors. We'll be right back to these, but first let's follow this line and see where it goes. It's going pretty far. Wow, this line is kind of comically long, and wait, we're back at the FET. That's right, this comically large line leads to the mystery arrow of the FET that we were looking at earlier. That's right, the thing that is controlling how much we're juicing up the gain, how much we're compressing basically, is this final output. By the way, this is called the sidechain. And that's the entire circuit. While we're zoomed out here, I should mention, by the way, that basically this entire middle section of the circuit is basically all original LevelLoc stuff, and the outside edges is where all the new features and changes and stuff are made. So now that we've seen all that, we can explain two different pretty important things. First of all is how the release speed works. Remember how I said that we dump a certain amount of juice into ground through these capacitors? Well, capacitors take a certain amount of time to discharge, and the amount of time that they take to discharge depends on the size of the capacitor. So basically what this lets us do is decide how long we're going to let previous parts of the input signal compress future parts of the input signal. In effects, what that means is if you want to do something like keep cymbals nice and crisp and tight, then you can keep it on a faster speed setting. And if you want to do something like boomy and big and reverberant, then you can have it on a slower release speed setting. The second thing that this explains is why the input volume is so important. Basically, if we look at the FET part, we're adding together two different things, the input volume and the extra juice that we're adding. And depending on the volume balance between the input and the juice, well, that drastically changes the sound that comes out of the other end. If we have the input much quieter than the juice signal, then basically what we're going to hear is the effect. We're going to mostly hear the compression, and that's how you get those big boomy effects. Well, you're not really hearing the drums as much as you're hearing the compression of the drums, if that makes sense. On the other end of the spectrum, if we have the input much louder than the effect, then it's going to be a much more subtle effect on top of the input, and it's going to act more like the distortion effect that we were looking at earlier. So now the combination of the pad switch and the input volume now basically act like a slider between having a compressor versus a distortion pedal and everything in between. Finally, it explains why this thing is the FredLoc, and that is because I made one very notable difference to the circuit. Maybe completely by accident a little bit. This guy. Or is it this guy? I don't know, and now that I took them out of the bag, I will never be able to tell them apart again. One of these is the original JFET, which was in the circuit, and the other one is a different type of FET called a MOSFET. You see, the original JFET that's in the circuit is really old and mostly discontinued, and I couldn't find a reliable part, so I thought I would get a replacement part, not realizing that I actually bought something that wasn't a good replacement. A couple of days later, I did eventually find a supplier of the original JFET, but by then I had already ordered the MOSFET version, so I thought I'd try it out. And guess what? Actually, I thought it sounded way better. Theoretically, I don't think this thing is supposed to work quite as well, but I swapped it out with the actual intended part in the circuit, and it just sounds better. When it's quiet and uncompressed, it gives you a much cleaner version of the sound than the original LevelLoc would have, but when it's boomy and super compressed, it still gives you all the punch and all of that boom that you would expect. So at the end of the day, you kind of get the best of both worlds, where you get a much wider range of sounds that you can get out of this box. I am far from the first person to think of swapping a MOSFET for a JFET in one of these types of circuits, and in fact, MOSFETs are used pretty commonly in limiters, which is why I think it works here, because this box is kind of both a limiter and a compressor in one. But as far as I'm aware, nobody's ever actually replaced the original JFET with a MOSFET in a LevelLoc clone, so that change is what makes this thing the FredLoc. Is it a big enough change to warrant sticking my name on it? No, it's pretty shameless actually. I didn't really make that big of a difference. But come on, FredLoc, it's like a pun on the term deadlock, and FredLoc just sounds so much cooler than LevelLocker. No offense, bow and arrow. Anyway, I know that was a lot of nerdy engineering explanation, but hopefully you actually learned a lot about how compressors work. When I started making music, a lot of these effects, especially compressors, were just kind of like these magic boxes, and I would wiggle the knobs until it made a sound that sounded kind of interesting. But the more I would dig deep and actually learn how these things work, the better I understand it, and the quicker I can actually get the sounds that I want, rather than just having a magical random sound. Okay, you have survived all of the boring nerdy talk, and we're almost at the demo, but just one last thing, which is the building montage of how I actually made this thing really quick. But I do have to admit something embarrassing before I show you the boards. You see, when you make your own circuit board, you can put any images you want on it, and I stuck my face on it. Branding? I made the whole board layout with my face on it, of course, and sent it off to a board manufacturer, which will go unnamed because no free ads. Anyway, once I received it, I soldered all of the components down, so I end up with this beauty. I then got this aluminum case, drilled and tapped out the holes to mount the board, and drilled out holes in the faceplates for all of the knobs and switches, which I get wired in here. Then to pretty this thing up, I busted out this new toy that I picked up super cheap from a neighbor and got to laser engraving the panels with labels and this cool swirly labyrinth pattern thing. And yeah, I also put my face on the box too. Look, if they don't want me to put my face on everything I designed, then why did I make it so damn easy? Anyway, this is how the final result came out, and if I do say so myself, I think it came out pretty beautiful, honestly. If you've watched my previous videos, you may have noticed that I'm usually just making little 3D printed robots and gadgets and that kind of thing. But this guy, with the laser engraved aluminum and the professional knobs and everything, I think actually it came out really good. At least it's the closest thing to a professional product that I've ever made. And finally, yes, I know that I promised you a demo of how this thing sounds like half the video ago now, and what's that? My boss says you finally earned it. I'm going to show you the difference on a full song mix. I've done a cover of the song Feels Like We Only Go Backwards, of course by Tame Impala, which is my favorite song on this album, Lonerism. And I'm going to be showing off the difference between first the full mix but with no compression at all whatsoever, just all the other effects, and then I'll turn the compression on and show you what it does in the context of a full mix. Hopefully you guys like it, and without further ado, here you go. So what'd you guys think? I did record a full cover of the entire song. If you guys want to hear that, I didn't just want to tack on a full 3-minute song to the end of this already very long video. But let me know in the comments if you're interested in hearing that, and I'll post it as a separate video on this channel. But also leave a comment if you have any suggestions, any feedback, anything like that. And yes, to some extent, I'm self-interested because when you like, subscribe, and comment on the video, it shows YouTube that you like the stuff, and engagement helps me connect with other new viewers. So if you want to help me out and if you want to interact with me, I would really appreciate it. And finally, the last and most extremely shameless plug I've ever done. I had to do minimum order quantities on a lot of this stuff, so I have like a lot of extra boards and components and that kind of thing. I was thinking of throwing up some DIY kits. As long as you can solder, you can make these things. I might put up the aluminum enclosures as well. If you're interested at all, leave a comment down below. If I do end up making a site or something like that where you can buy it, I'll definitely put this link in the description and maybe a pinned comment, we'll see. Also, if you just want to make the board and you don't want to pay me, you can just grab the schematic. I'll link it down below. It's basically the LevelLocker, so I definitely can't take credit for that. But I did redo the layout and I did put my MOSFET version. If you want to download it, you can make your own board. Obviously, it's a lot more work to do all of the ordering and that kind of thing yourself, but you know, that's how I did it, so it's not that bad. In any case, thank you so much for sticking around to the end of the video. I really do appreciate it. And like always, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye!